Hi, my name's Susie Bridges and welcome to Gallery Teachers Masterclass. And today we're going to be looking at correcting oral error. Okay, so the agenda for today, I'd really like it to be quite interactive. So those of you watching, I'm going to be pausing quite a lot when we get to different slides, just to give you an opportunity to see if you can contribute in the chat box. And then hopefully that will spark some great discussion in our Q&A at the end. So we'll have a little look at some attitudes to error, both from the teachers and the students' perspective. We'll have a think about when is a good decision to correct spoken error. We're going to have a look at some typical types of learner error and some possible reasons why students make mistakes, and then look at ways of doing some immediate oral error correction. And then, as I say, that's followed by the live Q&A, but it would be really great to see you getting involved and popping some answers in the chat box as we go. Okay, so let's have a think about attitudes to error. So I wonder if any of these resonate with you, and maybe you can just pop your number in the chat box as we go if any of these statements really kind of resonate with you. So I know, speaking to a lot of teachers, that they feel that correcting learners' mistakes is demotivating. And I think my CELTA trainees feel this particularly. I think they feel quite uncomfortable about correcting error until they just become a bit more practiced and learn how to do it more naturally. So it's interesting to have a look at students' response to that, but I'm interested to find out what teachers think about whether or not you think correcting mistakes is demotivating. I certainly believe that mistakes are acceptable and necessary part of the learning process. That's how we learn, right? Is by having a go and getting things wrong and then trying again and getting it better. So I'm wondering how you guys feel about whether or not mistakes are necessary. I think number 3 is interesting. I'm definitely guilty of this with my CELTA trainees. You know, I teach them how to do concept checking questions, for example, and then maybe 2 or 3 lessons later, they forget to write them, or they don't include them, or they don't go particularly well. So I sometimes do feel disappointed and annoyed if my learners make mistakes. In the language learning classroom, not so much. I understand that learning a language is difficult and that people forget things from lesson to lesson. So I'm curious to find out what you guys think about that one. And how about number 4? Do you feel surprised when learners are doing great and then after a while they start making mistakes again? I wonder if you've got experience of this in your classrooms and how that makes you feel as a teacher. And number 5, I think, is really important as well. So when we're listening to students speak, is it important to think about the seriousness of the error that they're making? Certainly for me, that's definitely true. And that helps me make a decision about when to correct or whether to correct. And as I say, we'll have a look at some reasons why we might correct very, very shortly. So I'm curious to find out which of these resonates with you. So hopefully there's some answers in the chat box that we can have a look at when we do the Q&A a little bit later. So here are some students' thoughts, which may be a little bit surprising. I think the first one is really interesting, that the student expects the teacher to correct every single mistake. And I'm sure you've had the experience when you're working with particularly the lower levels, that you need to pick your battles. You know, if we tried to correct every single error they made, they probably wouldn't get to the end of a sentence. And that's demotivating for sure. So I think it's important to find a balance of communication and accuracy. So obviously on a CELTA, we teach our candidates about delayed error correction. But this thought from a student is quite interesting, that if the teacher waits until the end of the lesson, then the mistake is already forgotten about. So there's definitely an argument for delayed error correction in a lesson, but I think this also supports the reason why we need to consider immediate error correction. So on the spot, ad hoc, dealing with the error as and when it occurs. I wonder if you recognize the third one. So maybe you've got some students who are super shy or really not that confident, and they're really quiet in the class because they're too afraid to make a mistake. So unless the utterance is going to be perfect, they choose not to speak. So I'm curious to find out if you've got any learners like that in your lessons. And then you might have the opposite. You know, you might have some really sort of like confident, extrovert, sociable, verbose learners who don't like to be interrupted. They're not bothered about making mistakes. And of course, if we never correct the mistakes, then we get something like the last utterance, which is fine in the safe environment of the classroom. But what happens then if we never correct mistakes and then the learner goes outside into the real world and maybe people are a little bit less patient than teachers and classmates? So it is really important that we do make sure that we're dealing with some error. Okay, so now we're going to have a think about if and when we need to deal with error. So whenever I hear a student make a mistake, in about like 0.03 seconds, a whole raft of questions go through my brain. And again, I'd really love to hear from you in the chat box about the top 3 that you might choose when deciding if and when to deal with an error. So the first thing I think about is what's the purpose of the lesson or the purpose of the activity. So if they're making a mistake in the lead-in, for example, to a listening lesson, then I'm probably just going to let it go because that's not the object of that activity. It's just to get the students engaged and interested and warmed up. But if they're making a mistake during a controlled practice task in a grammar lesson, then yes, for sure, I'm going to deal with error. And are the students making mistakes with something that they know? Or are they trying to experiment with something that they don't know? And again, is that the purpose of the lesson? If they're experimenting with new speech and it's going to take quite a while to correct, maybe I might choose to let the error go and just focus on the meaning. Or if I know they're making a mistake, like missing out the S on the third person in present simple, and I know they know this, then yes, I'll probably correct them. Thinking about the level of the learner, I think, is really important as well. If my A2 pre-intermediate learner is having a go at second conditional, again, I might choose to focus more on the meaning than get them worried about the grammar. Whereas if my B2 student is making a mistake with second conditional, that's something that I would expect them to know and get correct. So I would probably make sure that I fix that mistake. I think number 4 is really key, certainly for me. Does it get in the way of meaning? Can the student be understood? So if the error interferes with communication, I think that's a really good argument for correcting it. Again, as I mentioned, within the safe space of the classroom, we can be really tolerant and really patient and take our time. But outside in the real world, are people going to be able to kind of, do the thinking that they need in order to understand what the student is trying to say? So if it gets in the way of communication and meaning, then it's probably a good idea to go and correct it. I think number 5, all of them are important, to be honest, but I guess it's thinking about the top 3 for you that you think are the most important. This is another really, a really good one to think about. Can I fix it quickly? The whole purpose about doing immediate error correction is that it's exactly that. You can fix the mistake quite quickly, and then you can move on with the rest of the lesson. If it's going to take time to focus on the error and get the learner to see the reason why they made the error and then self-correct or peer correct, that might slow the lesson down. And then depending on the kind of lesson you're teaching, that might not be something that you want to get into at that moment. So can you fix the error really quickly? Is it a mistake being made by one person? Or is it an error that's coming up in a number of different areas in the class? Now that we're working virtually on Zoom, monitoring in breakout rooms is really important. You've got to really make sure that you're getting between the rooms so you get a really good sense of how your learners are doing and if they're making mistakes. So that's a little bit more challenging than when you're in a physical classroom where, even if you're standing in the center, you can sort of throw your ear either left or right and you can hear what's going on in the whole room. But this is a good thing to think about as well. So does everybody need some help or is it just one person? And then finally, are they just tired? Is it actually a mistake? Are they really making an error because they don't understand? Or is it because, it's the first lesson after lunch or the last lesson on a Friday afternoon and they've just lost concentration for a little bit? Okay, so hopefully, as we've been talking through, you've been popping some numbers in the chat box. So I'd be really interested to get a sense of which of the top 3 would work for you. So next, we're going to have a think about some typical types of error. So I've got 10 sentences that contain typical examples of students' mistakes. And again, I'd love it if you get involved in the chat box. So I'm going to pause before I reveal what the mistake is in each sentence. So you can have a go at identifying exactly what the error is, because obviously we need to know what the mistake is before we can then fix it. So I've taken some names from my recent group of CELTA graduates. And just as a classroom management point, I'm sure you guys do personalised worksheets, but I think it can be a really nice thing for the students to see their names in sentences as opposed to just the random names plucked out of the ether that we often see in course books. So the first one, Quinn's luggage is missing since Friday. Hopefully you've had a bit of time to write your answer in the chat box and you recognize that the type of mistake is, it is a grammar mistake. And more specifically, of course, it's the wrong tense. So hopefully the word since will tell you that we need the present perfect or the present perfect continuous. So the second one, again, another really common mistake, both in spoken and written language, where you live. So another grammar mistake, and this time the missing auxiliary. So really common that students forget the auxiliaries when they're making questions. So number 3, not a grammar mistake. If it was to be spoken, it would be Louisa's car is comfortable. So here we've got a problem with word stress. And then the next one, Ben, get me a mug of wine from the bar. Little trickier this one because it's vocabulary. So the collocation is wrong. We don't normally say mug of wine. Normally it will be glass of wine, of course. And it's a little bit rude. We're forgetting the please or would you mind or, could you, something like this. So we might need to help the students learn a little bit about politeness and register as well. Number 5. Hopefully you picked up that's another pronunciation mistake, this time with particular phonemes, the what versus the the. So of course, a common error in lots of different languages, like your Germans, your Russians, East Europeans, Indian speaking students as well. Number 6, again, a really common problem for learners. So incorrect collocation. So this is an argument for not teaching isolated individual words, trying to chunk language up. So rather than just teaching homework, teach it with its appropriate verb. So do your homework. And then the learner studies that as one item of language. And then hopefully that can reduce the number of mistakes with collocations. Number 7, this is the third person ending we talked about before. So this is the subject and the verb agreement. Because we've got he, we need to remember that the S is needed on the verb. Number 8 is a little trickier. Is it grammar? Is it vocabulary? Or did I trick you? Pronunciation problem. So the E versus the it mistake. Again, really common in all of the Romance languages. And minimal pairs is a good way to help the students practice this. Okay, number 9, Hetty and Gabby are very skinny girls. It's inappropriate, okay? They're not girls, they're ladies. Although, to be fair, when I'm going out with my girlfriends, I don't think any of us are kind of like, under 40 these days, but we still class ourselves as girls. But if you don't know somebody very well, then, calling them a girl as opposed to a woman might be seen as a little bit inappropriate. And also the connotation. So when we're teaching vocabulary, it might be important not just to teach the meaning, but whether or not it contains any extra meaning according to society. So if we think about, thin, slim, and skinny, they all have pretty much the same meaning, but maybe slim might be a nicer word choice than skinny or thin. They might have the connotation perhaps of, illness or being underweight. And then finally, Alex and Janet are people quite intelligent. Again, a really common mistake in our Romance languages, so getting the word order mixed up. So these are typical types of error. Of course, there's a lot more, but I think these are the ones that you probably come across most frequently in your lessons with language learners on a day-to-day basis. So if we think about reasons why learners make mistakes, I've got some model sentences here. And again, please get involved in the chat box if you've got some knowledge. That would be great to have you sharing. Thinking about the reasons why learners make mistakes. So for this first one, you can see the meaning of what they're trying to get at, right? So she run for the bus but not catched it. Obviously, it's incorrect grammar, but the reason that they did that is maybe overgeneralizing the rule. So they've obviously met the past simple because we can see the ed ending. So it's pretty typical in the lower levels that when you're dealing with the past simple, you deal with the regular verbs first, and then maybe the irregular verbs on a later lesson. So maybe what the student is doing is taking the ed ending rule that they've learned and just over applying it to all the verbs because they haven't yet learned that run and catch are irregular and have their own forms. Okay, so this would be an example of overgeneralization of a rule. Number two is really common with gender-based languages. English isn't, we just have the it. But a dictionary in French would be a he. So this is L1 interference, okay? So L1 is the native tongue, the mother tongue, and that is causing the error in L2 or L3 or whatever English is for that particular learner. Okay, so he knows all. So the student knows in their own language that a dictionary is male. So it's just making that assumption when making an English utterance. So L1 interference for that one. So you should have known better is really interesting because a lot of native speakers don't even recognize there's a mistake here. So it may be they were incorrectly taught it by a previous teacher because, of course, in the contraction, you should have known better that the weak form of the have actually sounds like an of. So maybe they were incorrectly taught it because that's what a previous teacher believed. Or maybe they picked up English by listening. And so that's what they think it might be. I haven't never been to Egypt as an example where the student has obviously met the particular grammar point. So here we're looking at present perfect, but it's not quite sunk in yet. So we know they've met it because they've got haven't and they've got been. So they've got both parts necessary for the present perfect. And then they've also got the never in there as well. So obviously a double negative doesn't work in English, but you can see they're giving it a go. So they've got this new language. So maybe trying to make a negative sentence with never, but they haven't quite cottoned on to the fact that if we use never, then we don't need to use the haven't. My father is a fisher. So you could argue this is overgeneralization of a rule. You know, if I drive taxis for a living, what's my job? I'm a driver. If I dance for a living, what's my job? I'm a dancer. If I teach for a living, what's my job? I'm a teacher. If I fish for a living, why wouldn't I be a fisher? Or it might be they just don't know the right word. Okay, they just don't know that there's a word for fisherman, for example. And then the last one, if I would win the lottery, I will share with you. So again, this is another utterance where it's evident that they've met the grammar structure that they're trying to produce. So second conditional here, and maybe they're just a little bit tired. It could also be they haven't quite fully assimilated the new rule, or it could just be that they're getting their wills and their woods mixed up. Okay, so there's lots of reasons why learners make mistakes, and we don't always know why. It could be more than one reason. So let's have a look at some examples. And again, please get involved in the chat box and write down a couple of suggestions for what you think about the sentences that I'm showing up at the moment. So it's perfectly possible there could be more than one reason why our students make mistakes. So will you borrow me your pen? In lots of languages, borrow and lend is the same word. So it could be that they're making a mistake because of L1 interference, or it could be they were incorrectly taught it. Maybe borrow and lend, you know, another common mistake that sometimes native speakers make. Goad with my friends and spend a good time there. So we've got another example of that overgeneralization of our past simple rule. Kids do this as well when they're learning language. So language acquisition means that you're overgeneralizing what you hear, but it's a good way to kind of pick up on the language, and then you're going to streamline your own errors as you get more language coming in. Number three, I didn't eat breakfast today. So again, maybe they haven't fully assimilated the new rule just yet. They've obviously met the negative past simple this time, but they're getting a little bit confused between do I use the ate or do I use the eat, which is a normal thing for students to get confused about. Another example with conditionals, they're pretty tricky to get right because you've got your two clauses. So it could be they're overgeneralizing the would rule. It could be that maybe they're a little bit tired. It could be that they've met the conditional and they just haven't quite understood that you only need to use would once and generally not in the if clause. My car, she's broken. So again, your French speakers are going to make mistakes with this particular aspect of language, thinking that, car is a female in French, but it doesn't have a gender in English. So a common mistake. And can you help me make my homeworks? So two mistakes there. So one with the collocation. So make my homework, obviously, it should be do my homework. And then the countability problem of homeworks being pluralized when it's uncountable and needn't be. And again, for me, that's evidence to support the fact that when we're teaching words, we're teaching vocabulary, to maybe give the students a bit of extra information, like is it countable or uncountable? Does it have an irregular past simple form if you're teaching a verb? All right, just so we can help the students and then, reduce their chances of making errors in the future. Okay, so those are some causes of error. So then how do we correct spoken output? So you can see in bold, we go to the beach yesterday. This is the utterance by our student. So that's represented by the S. And now we've got 6 different teacher responses. Okay, so thinking about whether or not this is a thumbs up or a thumbs down, again, I'm really interested to hear which of the teacher utterances you think is maybe a better way of correcting learner error than some of the others. So maybe just pop your, T2, T6 in the chat box as we speak, and have a think about which of these utterances, which of these responses rather, is the best way to help the student who made this utterance. So the student says, we go to the beach yesterday. Teacher 1's response would be, okay, yesterday, grammar. So focusing on the word in the sentence that the student will recognize, and then telling them it's a grammar mistake, and then that will hopefully prompt a little bit of self-correction. So I wonder whether you think that's a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Number 2, maybe a little trickier. So the student says, we go to the beach yesterday, and teacher 2 says, yesterday you... Often the student will say, go to the beach yesterday, because maybe they think the teacher hasn't heard. So me personally, I don't think this one is the greatest way of correcting the mistake, because it doesn't really draw the student's attention to the fact that a mistake has been made and what the mistake is, in the same way that, for example, teacher 1's offer does. Okay, number 3. So we go to the beach yesterday. Oh, okay, not quite. Look, so we go to the beach yesterday. We go. So using the finger technique is something that I tend to do quite a lot, and a lot of teachers really struggle with it until, of course, you practice and it becomes more natural. But if you're holding up your hands and you're indicating with your fingers which word contains the error, this can give students like a visual, physical representation of what the sentence might look like and support them a little bit while they self-correct. So for me, number 3 is a thumbs up. Teacher 4, sorry, do you mean you go every day? So I don't think that's very helpful, because it's not really helping the student understand that they've made a mistake. If the student is making a mistake with we go to the beach yesterday, it seems to me they're pretty low level. And so, do you mean you go every day? It's trying to ask them about the difference between, present simple versus past simple. But me personally, I don't think that's the best way to support the student to recognize the error or to fix it. Number 5 maybe keeps the conversation flowing in a more natural way. So it's responding to the content of what the student was saying. Oh, you went to the beach. That's nice. Who did you go with? So you went to the beach is what we would call reformulation. So it's basically repeating back what the student has said, but correctly. This can be great because it can keep the conversation going. And by modeling the language, maybe over time, the students can start to understand what they're hearing. But again, it doesn't draw overt attention to the fact that the learner made a mistake. So they may be oblivious to the fact that the teacher's been just corrected them, and they may just want to carry on the conversation. And sometimes that's okay too. And then at the bottom, we've got no comment. And then right at the end of the lesson, the teacher will say, we go to the beach yesterday. Can anyone correct that? So here again, we've got this example of delayed error correction, which can be great because it's anonymous. If you wait until the end of the lesson, nobody's going to remember exactly who said what. I sometimes find, if I've written some utterances on the board and I've asked the learners to have a go at self-correction, because they feel quite safe in that learning environment, they'll often claim, oh, number 3, that was me, I said this, which is really lovely. But sometimes students want the anonymity. So delayed error correction can be a nice way of doing that, because, of course, immediate error correction does draw attention to the error. Okay, so interesting to find out what you guys think about different ways of responding to the spoken output from the student. If you forced me to choose, I'd probably go number 1 or number 3. Okay, so looking at different ways to correct oral error. So I'm sure you've all used the old, yesterday, past tense. So the hand over the shoulder, again, a visual representation of the grammar, so the student can get a sense of what it is that they're needing to do. Fingers can be really useful to show where the wrong word is, to show that maybe a word isn't needed, to show maybe that there's an extra word that doesn't need to be there, or that the student has maybe jumped over a word and they need to fill in a missing word. So I really like the finger correction technique. It does take a little bit of time and practice, but I think it can be a really useful and quick way of correcting a whole different range of errors. So this is a good one. If a student is talking to you, it's easy to look puzzled and go, try that again. Again, your face will tell them that an error has been made, but you're not drawing attention to where in the sentence the error has come from. Repeat the sentence, stopping just before the incorrect word. This kind of requires a bit of mind reading, I think, on the part of the learner, or they might just think that you've misheard them and they'll just fill the sentence in as you go. But for some teachers, it can be a really effective way of drawing attention to error if you're consistently using it and you've trained your students to do that. So if we think about our example of like yesterday, I go to the beach. Yesterday, you. So, you'd like the student to say went to the beach as opposed to go to the beach, teacher. I just told you that. So I've got mixed feelings about that one because I do think it requires a little bit of mind reading. And I think the learners have got enough on their plate without trying additional challenges. So this one I think is a little better. Now you can repeat the whole sentence, but focus on the wrong word with either your voice or your face. Okay. Okay. So yesterday I go to the beach. Yeah. And whether you've got the single eyebrow raise, which I wish I could do, but can't, or you've got the wrinkled nose, or you've got the head tilt, or you've got the kind of wiggly fingers. Each teacher will have their own kind of idiosyncratic way of drawing a learner's attention to the error. And when you've got good rapport, I like to think that that's not a problem for the learner. They understand what you're trying to do, and they recognize that there's an opportunity to self-correct. Peer correction as well can be a really useful way to involve everybody in error correction. So maybe you don't want to put your student on the spot by passing the error directly back to them, but you can offer it up to the whole class, particularly if it's a controlled practice activity. You want the people in the room to pay attention to mistakes and be able to recognize and hopefully correct mistakes. So asking for other people to help is a great way to correct oral error. If you've got the language on the whiteboard and somebody has made a mistake with that language, you can just directly point at the language and just ask them to self-correct. Same thing if it's a pronunciation mistake. So if you've got the phonemes available, you might want to point at the right phoneme. Or if you've done any kind of pronunciation training with your students, you might silently mouth the word. So for example, reminding them they need the E sound, rather than the it sound, or vice versa. Okay, so these are some typical ways to help correct oral error. And I've put reformulation at the bottom because you're not correcting their error per se. You're just repeating what they said to keep the conversation going without necessarily drawing attention to the fact that an error has been made. So these are all different ways to correct error. So here are some sentences that I'd be really interested to find out how you would correct if you were working with learners who made some of these example mistakes. So I've got the techniques on the right hand side for you to see. Maybe you might have a particular favorite that you really, really like, or maybe you might think that different errors will call for different techniques. So the first one, he lost the bus. So lost is a really common mistake. And again, as teachers, we have to think about whether or not drawing the student's attention to the error will help them if they don't know the word. Remember, one of the causes of error is that the students just don't know the right word. So maybe lost in L1 is the translation. So it could be L1 interference, and it might be that we just have to correct them. So instead of saying he lost the bus, so he was late, he lost the bus, not lost. So I might show them that it's wrong and invite them to correct. And if they don't know the right word, then teach it. Okay, so if I'm late and the bus has gone, then it's missed the bus, not where's the bus? Where's it gone? What did I do with it? All right, so just again having a little bit of fun with it, so the students don't feel kind of singled out or picked on. So again, for me, number two, I would be a big fan of the finger correction technique. So if my student is saying, "You must to go home now," "You must to go home now," "You must." All right, so that's what I would do. I wish I could do the whole Star Trek Spocky thing, so I've got greater finger control, but sadly, after years and years of trying, can't do it, so I need to use my other hand. But if I do this, I can show the students, okay, so you must go home now. I can show them that they don't need this extra word. All right, so that's why I think the finger technique is really, really useful, because it's really varied. So this is a pronunciation mistake. Again, I'd be inclined to go with the fingers. Okay, so instead of telling my students, all right, so we don't say vegetables, it's vegetables, vegetables. Okay, so not vegetables, vegetables. So for me, the finger technique is really, really varied. So you can work on grammar, you can work on missing words, you can work on pronunciation. For number four, for your Spanish speakers, this would be the example of kind of silently mouthing the right sound, because they know, the Spanish speakers, they have issues with the but and the but. So if they're speaking to me, oh, I live in a small village near Madrid, and I go, hopefully that might prompt them into self-correcting, it should be village, not village. He no come to school yesterday. So there's a couple of errors there. Again, if it was me, I'd go, okay, it's yesterday. So come, trying to use the face querying, but drawing attention to the fact that it's a grammar mistake. And then probably, okay, he no came to school yesterday, might be the next thing I get. And so again, I might have to go in and help them with, all right, so he come to school yesterday. So he come to school yesterday. And then trying to get them to insert that auxiliary didn't, which is commonly forgotten when they're just picking up the language for the first time. And with your finger correction technique, don't think that you have to use all of the words in the sentence. The most important part, you can just show them and model them exactly what you mean as if it was written down. Of course, if you've got a board handy, then you could also write it down. But if you're walking around the room, just doing some monitoring, a little bit of quick finger technique can be a great way of supporting the students to fix a mistake really quickly. And then the last one, my mother and father has been married 30 years. Maybe draw attention to the fact that it's two people, mother, father, two people. Okay, and then hopefully have them self-correct. But if that doesn't work, then my mother and father has been. So repeating the word with the querying expression or the querying tone of voice. So it'd be really great to find out if you use any of these particular methods, or if you've got your own methods that you use that you find effective. I'd love to learn more about error correction. Okay, so we're coming to the end of the session. I'd really encourage you as a challenge to have a go at both immediate and delayed error correction. Every day if you can, but certainly every week. Obviously, delayed error correction is easier because you've got time to hear the utterances, pick the ones that you want to work on, and then get the board prepared while your students are working on an activity. Immediate tends to be a little bit more challenging because you need to respond very, very quickly. But if you practice 3 or 4 different techniques until they become more fluid, more natural, more familiar, hopefully you'll be really well equipped then to deal with both immediate and delayed error correction to support your learners on their language learning journey. Final thoughts that if we never correct our learners, if we never help them recognize mistakes and fix mistakes, then these mistakes become set in stone. Okay, technical term, they fossilize. And so the students, if they're using a lot of fossilized wrong English, may not be understood outside the learning environment that we've created, where everybody is in a safe space to experiment and play with language. Obviously, if they're going into the outside world, people don't have the time or the qualifications or the inclination to really draw out exactly what it is that the learner is trying to say. So error correction is really important because we don't want our learners to be out in the world not being understood by people. We don't want those mistakes to fossilize. So we've managed to cover attitudes to error and deciding when to correct error. We've looked at different types of error and reasons why students make mistakes. We've looked at a number of different techniques to correct error, and the live Q&A is coming up. So I'm really excited to hear any of your questions and also your comments about your thoughts and feelings around error. Really hope you've enjoyed the activities today. I've really enjoyed talking to you and look forward to talking to you a little bit more very shortly. Here are the resources that I use to prepare the website, so you can have a look at the book. Obviously, Jeremy Harmer's classic How to Teach English is great. There's a couple of chapters that deal with error in there. And then there's always useful blogs and information on the website. Teaching English is a great one. And of course, there's going to be other fantastic workshops that you guys can check out on the Gallery Teachers website. Okay, so I've got a couple of questions here. First one, do students really care about being corrected? My experience of speaking to students over the 20 odd years that I've been teaching is that yes, they do really care about being corrected. You often get students on a sliding scale. So you'll get the ones who are like, super bothered about all the mistakes. And then you'll get the ones who are maybe a bit less bothered about making mistakes. But I definitely believe that your learners do really care about being accurate and being understood outside the classroom into the real world. If teachers try to correct every error students make, I don't think a student would get to the end of a sentence. So no, I don't think a teacher should correct every error that a student makes. A teacher should be able to distinguish the difference between maybe a slip because they're tired versus a more serious error, and then only correct the errors that the student really needs in order to be understood. So it's definitely not important for teachers to correct every single mistake that the learners make.